Have you ever noticed how bitter creative people get when they stop creating? What if I told you that unused creativity doesn't just disappear? It rots. In this video, I will show you why unexpressed ideas turn into envy, resentment, emotional decay, and how to break that cycle before it breaks you. Because if you don't bring your ideas to life, they'll destroy you from the inside out. There's a heaviness that builds up in creative people who don't create. It's not just sadness or boredom, it's something completely deeper. It starts quietly. You're gonna go about your life, scrolling, comparing, criticizing, pretending you're fine. But deep down, you know you're not living the way your mind was designed to live. And it's starting to show. In the way you talk, in the way you react, in the way you secretly resent anyone who's actually out there doing something. Creative people who don't create are dangerous. Not because they're bad, but because they're carrying something that's trying to come through them, and it has nowhere to go. That unexpressed energy starts to ferment. It's going to become bitterness, envy. It becomes this constant low-grade anger towards the world. When you have ideas but never bring them to life, you start turning that energy inward. You convince yourself that you're not ready, not qualified, not talented enough. And in doing so, you rob yourself of the one thing that could have given your life meaning. You become your own prison warden. So most people don't realize how psychological this is. When you suppress your creative impulse, your brain doesn't stop producing ideas, it just stops trusting you to handle them. You stop being this reliable host in a way, and you stop being chosen. And ideas, in a way, are alive. They want to exist, they want to find a host willing to take the risk. If they knock on your door and you ignore them long enough, they're going to go somewhere else. And that's why sometimes you see someone release something you thought about a year ago. And you feel that, that frustration. Like I literally thought about this. I was planning to do this, but you didn't. You lost it. You refused it. You turned it away. And now someone else is living out the life, that could have been yours, or a project that could have been yours, a collaboration that could have been yours. The problem is that creativity isn't something you can bury without consequence. It's not neutral. So if you don't channel it outward, it's going to devour you inward. And that's why unexpressed artists become insufferable. And it's not because they want to be, but because they're living in conflict with their own nature. They have an inner world begging to be built, but they never give it form. So it rots. They rot. And you start to see it in how they talk, it's very cynical, it's detached, constantly saying things like, oh, that's overhyped, or I could do that, or, it's like they criticize everything because critique becomes a form of false creation. It's easier to destroy someone else's art than face your own inactions. Every hateful tweet or every jealous thought, every bored sigh, that's the residue of creation denied. But here's the part that really matters. That resentment isn't proof that you hate others, it's proof that you miss yourself. And I think that's the part of you that used to dream. It used to sketch or draw or write or make or imagine. It's still alive. It's just buried underneath that fear or self-doubt. And you tell yourself oh, it's about time, right? It's about money or equipment or opportunity. But that's not the truth, is it? The truth is you're scared to look stupid, or you're scared to try and fail. You're scared to realize you're not as good as you imagined. But that's the price of creation. You have to face who you are before you become who you want to be. And that's why most people never start. No one's going to tell you this, but you're not supposed to feel ready. You never were. Readiness is the death of creativity. So if you wait for the right time, it's never going to come. If you wait until you have permission, no one's going to give it. Because art doesn't belong to the qualified. It belongs to the willing. The moment you stop creating, you start decaying. You become passive, like you become reactive almost. You start scrolling through the lives of others like this ghost, like just haunting what you could have been. And you start replacing your own imagination with just consumption at this point. You live through other people's art instead of your own art. And you call it, oh, inspiration, right? But it's not. It's this like numbing agent to make you forget what you were starving from. And that hunger you feel when you see someone else thriving creatively, that's not jealousy. I think it's recognition. That's your soul, saying like you're supposed to do this too, you know? But instead you're watching someone else live your unlived life. And the irony of all of this is the longer you wait to create, the worse it's going to get. Your standards rise while your confidence shrinks. You start obsessing over tools, aesthetics, concepts, everything except actually doing it. You become the philosopher of ideas and the undertaker of execution. You become a dreamer who never dreams. And it's not just sad, it's destructive. Because when creative people stop creating, they start leaking their creative energy in incredibly toxic ways. Either they gossip instead of design, they judge instead of explore, imitate instead of imagine. It's not that they stopped being creative, it's that their creativity mutated into something darker. Creation becomes this corrosion, and that corrosion just spreads. And I think this is why creative stagnation doesn't just hurt you, it almost hurts everyone around you. Because unexpressed art turns into this like emotional pollution, right? Your apathy becomes contagious, your envy becomes a weapon, you become the kind of person who poisons the air of possibility. Like you were meant to build, but you're just destroying, and you were meant to inspire, but you're draining. All that potential, all that brilliance, that imagination, it goes to waste because you weren't capable, but because you were too afraid of what people might think. And you were waiting for validation instead of just listening to the impulse itself. You were waiting for someone to say, go, do it, instead of realizing that no one's ever going to tell you that. There is no approval committee to your destiny. You gotta understand that. The truth is that no one cares whether you do it or not. And I think that's the most freeing thing once you accept it. Because if no one cares, you can finally do it for yourself. That's the shift. That's the moment you reclaim your power, your future. You stop saying, like, I'll start when I feel ready. And you're going to start saying, I'll start because I'm tired of not feeling alive. You stop asking, oh, what if I fail? What if it doesn't turn out how I thought it was going to turn out? What if I don't get this collab? What if they don't respond to me? And you're going to start asking, what if this is what I'm meant to do? Because the world doesn't need more perfect art. It needs honest art. It needs more people who are willing to make something, even if it's rough, even if it's weird, even if it doesn't get a single like. Because that's where the real power is in making something because you have to. Not because you're trying to prove something. You create to stay sane. You create to stay alive. You have to be obsessed with it. And maybe that's why the world feels so numb lately, There's no obsession. There's no passion. Because too many creative people are sitting on their gifts, thinking they're protecting them when really they're just suffocating. Too many people are mistaking fear for practicality. Too many are hiding behind the illusion of someday. But someday never comes. Sorry. That there's only now. And if you don't create now, the energy will only find another outlet through your frustrations, your cynicism, your self-loathing, whatever it could be. That's the rod. That's the cost of unused potential. And you can spend your life resenting others for doing what you were too afraid to do, or you can just finally start. Because in the end, the choice is brutally simple. You either give your creativity life, or it takes yours. You're not lazy. You're clogged in a way. That boredom, that jealousy, the apathy you feel aren't random. They're signs of repressed creativity trying to escape. And if you ignore it long enough, it turns you into someone you don't even recognize. In this chapter, I want to talk about why creative people who don't create become dangerous, and to themselves and to everyone around them. I think validation is a slow poison disguised as love. It starts small, right? It's a few compliments, a few likes, a little bit of attention, but before you know it, you're creating not to express something, but to maintain approval. And that's the beginning of the end for most creative people. Because the moment your art becomes this performance for validation, it stops being yours. You stop listening to your own voice. You start building according to everyone else's. You begin molding your expression around what will please and what will not what will heal. And the worst part is, it feels good, right? That's why it's so dangerous. That dopamine, the praise, the algorithm. You start to believe that, this is what success is. Being seen. Being seen isn't the same as being understood. And being understood isn't the same as being fulfilled. So what most people call burnout isn't exhaustion, it's disconnection, really. You've been performing a version of yourself for so long that you've lost touch with what made you love creating in the first place. You start chasing reactions instead of truths. You create from fear of being forgotten, not from joy of being alive. There's a difference between an artist and a performer, really. An artist creates from the inside out. A performer creates from the outside in. And most people, without realizing it, have become the performers now. Performers of taste, authenticity, rebellion. We live in a time where the aesthetic of creativity has replaced the act of it. And it's not about painting anymore. It's about posting the brushstroke, right? It's not about writing. It's about curating the quote. Everyone's busy showing evidence of creativity and not actually creating. Because being creative used to be this identity you earned. Now it's something you just perform. And the saddest part is that when you perform long enough, you honestly forget who you are underneath it. You start measuring your worth through numbers, followers, engagement, visibility, all of it pretending to mean something. But these things are just mirrors reflecting approval. And it's not that you stopped being creative, right? It's that you started creating for the wrong reasons. I think the real tragedy is how invisible this shift is starting to feel like. You tell yourself you're just adapting or strategizing but in reality, you're slowly trading your authenticity for acceptability. You start avoiding risk. You make things you don't care about because they're going to perform well. And you call that growth, but it's just decay dressed as success. And the truth is that validation is a currency with no real value. You can't spend it on peace. You can't buy integrity with it. It only buys silence, really. The kind where you stop questioning why you're doing what you're doing. It's hard to admit that most of our creative crises are more so self-inflicted. We let the world convince us that art isn't enough unless it's profitable or scalable or viral. But art was never supposed to make you rich. It was supposed to just make you alive, whole. When you start treating creativity as a transaction, you strip it completely of its sacredness. You turn what was once healing into labor. You start clocking in and out of your own imagination. That's insane. Maybe that's why so many artists are miserable right now. Because deep down, we all know, we've betrayed our own voice. And you could feel it when you're forcing something. You could feel it when the spark is gone. When you're making work and you don't even, feel anything. You just feel like a robot at this point, just making whatever. And it's a strange kind of death, dying in plain sight while everyone else is just applauding. Your work still looks good, but your heart isn't in it. And no algorithm can fake that. You sacrifice depth for attention. You sacrifice integrity for recognition. You sacrifice peace for relevance. And the scariest part is you get so used to it. You start to like it. You start mistaking noise for impact. You start thinking the world owes you a reaction, but the world doesn't owe you anything. And art doesn't owe you a platform. So when you really start to understand that, something starts to shift. You stop trying to be the best and just start trying to be real. You stop comparing yourself to everyone else because you realize they're not your competition. They're just people trying to survive their own insecurities, just like you. When you build your sense of self on external validations, you hand over control of your identity. You're only as good as your last post, your last drop, your last piece, your last response. You become a product of the public and not the person behind it. And when the audience moves on, because they always do, you'll be left asking yourself this terrifying question of, who am I without their attention? And I think that question really can break someone, because they've built everything around being seen, not known. It's not that validation is evil, I just think it's very incomplete. I don't think applause can't replace purpose. And if you let it, it'll really turn your art into a job and your joy into this performance. So I would suggest to stop waiting for someone to tell you that your work matters. You don't need approval. Create because you can't not. Create because it's the only thing that makes you feel real. Because when you strip away the noise, the views, the numbers, all that's left is whether you had something honest to say, and that's enough. It always was. You don't need to be understood. You don't need to be true, because when your art is real, it doesn't need to shout. It just exists as proof that you're here. You cared enough to make something out of nothing, and that's the difference between being known and being remembered. One fades, and the other one lingers. And that's what validation can never give you. So make peace with being unseen, because that's where the real work happens. That's where you reclaim your creative soul from the hands of everyone else. And when you finally stop asking, do they like it, is it good, you start asking, do I mean it? And I think that's when you become untouchable. That's when you become an artist again.